The movie starts with Margaret having a nightmare where she sees a group of priests inside a tomb where they are checking the sarcophagus of a dead queen named Tara. One of the priests suddenly cuts off one of Tara's hands, which is then taken outside and fed to dogs. On entering the tomb back, the priests close the sarcophagus and then head out. However, Tara's hand happens to be moving on the floor, with one of the dogs even getting killed by it. When the priests come out, they are met by a serious wind that throws them off balance, and before they know what's going on, something slits their throats, and they all die, with the hand still moving on. Margaret finally wakes up from this nightmare, almost screaming her lungs out, but her father, Julian, comes right in to check on her. As he's doing this, a man living just across the street named Corbeck seems to be spying on Julian and Margaret. In the morning, Julian gifts his daughter a shiny ring for her birthday gift, even though she tells him her birthday is still the next day. Julian tells her to immediately wear it and also treasure it, and Margaret says she will. As they're talking, Margaret hears the horn of a car and tells her dad she's got to go. When she gets out, she meets her boyfriend, Todd, who tells her he's glad she could make it. As Todd drives off with Margaret, Corbeck is still looking through his window. He then later goes over to check a couple of notes on his table, after which he leaves the house. Elsewhere at a psychiatric hospital, two doctors are moving a patient into a room when they decide to check on a patient named Berrigan. The men look surprised that Berrigan is not causing any trouble, and they then leave him alone. Apparently, Berrigan is paying attention to a strange arrangement of stars that he seems to be seeing on the rug in his room. Later on, Margaret and Todd reach Todd's house, and after a while there, Todd catches the attention of Margaret's ring, and he's very amused at the sight of it. He takes it off her and begins to sound really curious about the ring, suggesting that it could have been from Julian's expedition. As he manages to get her curious, they both then head over to see a man named Jeffrey. At the sight of the ring, Jeffrey looks terrified and asks where Todd got the ring, and just then, Margaret shows up, and on seeing her, Jeffrey goes into shock. Meanwhile, Corbeck goes to visit Berrigan and starts looking around like he's searching for something. Berrigan gets a hint of what Corbeck is looking for, and he tries to hide behind it so Corbeck immediately understands what Berrigan is doing. As he tries to reach for what is inside the locker, Berrigan attacks Corbeck, and a doctor has to come and help Corbeck. It then turns out that there's a snake relic inside the locker. Elsewhere, a fortune teller named Helen has to cut her session short when she suddenly sees the same arrangement of stars as Berrigan, and she starts to look really terrified. Later on, Jeffrey is now looking okay, and after one of his workers leaves, he goes over to check a box in his locker that had a skull relic, which seems to get him terrified. As he's at it, Corbeck arrives to see him, and Jeffrey tells him about the experience earlier in the day, saying that Margaret was someone else. However, Corbeck tells him that it was actually Margaret, and she was Julian's daughter, much to Jeffrey's surprise. Later that night, Margaret has another nightmare where she hears the voice of Tara, who calls herself the Queen of Darkness, saying that her soul has been wandering, waiting for her mortal body. She also mentions that she had led a team of explorers to her tomb, so they could hold on to her treasures for her. Quite surprisingly, Julian, Corbeck, Berrigan, Jeffrey, and Helen are the members of the team she's talking about. They are soon able to open her sarcophagus, where they see that Tara is missing one of her hands. Helen then calls their attention to the missing hand, and from there, Julian is able to get the ring off it and also get her name. Margaret then wakes up from her dream and insists that she's got to go home, worried that something is wrong. Meanwhile, in the basement in the house, Julian is admiring the body of Tara in her sarcophagus. Todd and Margaret are then able to reach the house right in time to find Julian injured in the basement. Before he passes out, Julian asks them to call a doctor named Putnam, and Todd goes over to do this while Margaret looks around the room to admire all the artifacts. Soon enough, Putnam arrives and checks on Julian. He then tells Margaret that they can't tell the police. He also tells her there's not much he can tell her about what happened, and that she'd have to ask Julian when he wakes. Before he leaves, he says Julian is his priority, and that if there was an emergency, Margaret needed to call him immediately. Later that night, when Todd is sleeping, Margaret makes her way down to the basement, where she assesses Tara's body in the sarcophagus and sees that they look alike. As she's still looking around, Corbeck appears to be in the room and startles her. He tells her he's Julian's old friend and he was there to help her. However, she doesn't seem interested as she shouts for Todd to come down. Not long after, she remembers his name and says that Julian asked that he never come to the house, though he insists that he's the only one who can help her. He then asks about the ring, and since Margaret knows nothing about it, he tells her it belonged to the Queen of Darkness, and also tells her how they had found her tomb due to Julian's curiosity and drive to make a mark in Egyptology. Meanwhile, Todd wakes up on hearing his name and searches for Margaret until he reaches the basement and hears Corbeck talking about the Queen of Darkness, and then sits to listen as Corbeck also mentions that Margaret was born at the exact same time that her father had seen Tara, and it was a possibility as to why she looked like Tara. After a while, Todd startles them as they didn't know he was there. As he ignores Corbeck's handshake, he moves over to check on Tara. Corbeck then talks about Tara's power, saying they needed to understand it before it got the better of them, just like it did with Julian. With that, he asks that the old team be reassembled so that all the relics could be returned. Todd then starts by calling Jeffrey, but Jeffrey gets too scared when Todd mentions Margaret's name, and he ends the call before Todd can even say anything. Together, Todd and Margaret then go over to see Berrigan. Berrigan is very scared when he sees Margaret, and since they might not be able to convince Berrigan to come with them easily, Margaret decides to act as Tara, and this doesn't exactly play out well, with Berrigan looking terrified, and then doctors coming over to restrain him. Later that day, Margaret meets Putnam treating her father, and after he's through, he tells her that Julian kept everything about Tara away from her to keep her safe. But Margaret feels like she's been drawn into it all her life. Later on, two doctors come over to further restrain Berrigan, and in a bid to keep him calm, they bring out the snake relic that Berrigan had been storing in his locker. The doctors soon leave, and the room somehow goes into chaos, with screams, and then the window opening widely, causing a wind to come in. The snake eventually happens to attack Berrigan, and he dies as a result. That night, Margaret goes into the basement to check on Tara and is also quite happy to see that the snake relic has returned. The next day, Julian slightly recovers, and he's then able to tell Margaret that he gave her the ring to protect her, though Margaret is curious as to whether she got Tara's powers too. As she wants to know more, she tells Julian about Berrigan and how the snake relic made it back, and Julian is beyond surprised. Margaret also tells him that Corbeck has been helping her, and while he's trying to tell her not to listen to anything Corbeck has to say, he becomes too weak and then passes out. Margaret then sees Corbeck entering his house and goes over to meet him. She tells him about Berrigan and the snake relic, but Corbeck already knows. Just as Margaret is then talking about how Tara's powers were fascinating to her, she thinks she can be able to use it, and unsurprisingly, Corbeck accepts. He goes on to talk more about all they could do with Tara's powers and all the control they could have. He also tells Margaret that Julian is too weak to understand their thought process, and they only needed to do it together. Margaret then heads out, saying she's got some shopping to do with regard to the artifacts. On her way out, she sees Todd but brushes him off, saying she has to leave and also rejecting his idea of going to see Jeffrey again. As Margaret walks off, Todd furiously heads towards Corbeck's house, after which he makes his way in. When he sees Corbeck, he asks what he's doing to Margaret, but instead of giving a straight answer, he tries to be coy, and as Todd tries to attack him, Corbeck brings out his gun and scares him, then telling Todd that she had only gone shopping. Elsewhere, Jeffrey learns of Berrigan's death and is then forced to check on his own relic in the box. As he's doing it, Margaret comes to him and gives him a scare and asks him to return it. However, Jeffrey accuses her of killing Berrigan and eventually runs out the window with the relic in the box. As he gets outside, though, he mistakenly kicks it and is unable to find the relic itself, and even though he wants to look for it, the sound of a dog sees him run away. About the same time, Todd arrives at Jeffrey's office and is surprised to see Margaret, especially after she had said she didn't want to see Jeffrey. Margaret lies about having a change of heart and asks that they leave together, saying Jeffrey was not around. Todd, however, says he wasn't leaving as he still wanted to check around, and after a while searching for Jeffrey both inside and then outside the office, he sees that Jeffrey is dead and then carries him away. Meanwhile, Margaret has made it home, and as she's looking at Tara, she sees that the skull relic with Jeffrey has returned, and together with Corbeck, who is also in the room, they look happy. Todd soon reaches the house and asks that Margaret leave with him, blaming her and Corbeck for those who had died. Margaret refuses, and Todd slaps her out of anger, after which he leaves the room, with Margaret telling him not to leave, or he'd die. As he doesn't answer, and he's already gotten into his car, headed away, Margaret screams his name, and suddenly he has an accident and dies. At the house, Corbeck continues to convince her to let Tara's power grow inside her, instead of crying over Todd. He also then tells her that the ring was with her at the right time, and that Margaret was born for it. After his speech, though, Margaret falls to the ground and passes out. Meanwhile, Julian is able to make his way to the basement and suddenly sees Margaret lying on the ground and immediately asks what Corbeck did to her. Corbeck says she's all right, though he also calls her a medium and says that she'd still end up dying so that Tara would come alive. Julian knows it's the truth, and when Corbeck leaves the room, he says he can stop that from happening by making sure Tara doesn't get to the last relic by taking over Margaret's body. He then calls Putnam over and asks him to sedate Margaret while she's dreaming. However, Putnam takes too long and ends up getting killed. When Julian comes in and sees Putnam's dead body, he tries to clear it. Just then, Corbeck comes in and says he'll help Julian. As he's carrying the body with Julian, Corbeck talks about being able to control Tara, and all they needed to do was find Margaret, saying she must have gone to Helen for the last relic. Soon after, Margaret arrives at Helen's place, and on seeing her, Helen tries to attack Margaret, but Margaret is able to convince her to return the relic, which Helen ends up doing. However, Margaret only touches it and then leaves, after which something starts striking Helen. When Corbeck gets to Helen's house, he sees that she's dead, and there, he also sees Margaret call on him to come with her. After incinerating Putnam's body, Julian finds out that the last relic was now in place. He also sees Tara's missing hand, just after Margaret comes in and heals the wound on his neck. Corbeck doesn't waste any time to start the ritual to bring back Tara, and first he places the missing hand in its rightful place, after which he starts reciting a scroll. As he's doing it, Tara's hand starts reattaching, and Julian says it's not worth bringing her back if they had to die, and then convinces Margaret that they had to stop Corbeck, and just like that, they attack Corbeck and kill him. However, Tara is already awake in the sarcophagus, and as they're also about to kill her, she's able to handle them, first killing Julian, and then Margaret, who repeatedly stabs her in the process. Later on, the whole room collapses, crushing everything in the room, though Margaret is the only one who gets rescued from the collapse, with her body entirely wrapped in bandages, as she then suddenly opens her eyes. And that is how it ended. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.